On behalf of the United States Institute of Peace, we're delighted to welcome everyone to this very special event. My name is Lise Grande, and I'm the head of USIP, which was established by the U.S. Congress in 1984 as a nonpartisan public institution dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. The Institute is very proud to be part of the many initiatives that promote reconciliation, cooperation, and deeper understanding in the wake of the war between the United States and Vietnam, and also between the U.S. and Laos and the U.S. and Cambodia. Starting last year, USIP launched the Vietnam War Legacies and Reconciliation Initiative, which focuses on supporting the many efforts already underway to help resolve war legacies, which include, of course, Agent Orange, landmine clearance, unexploded ordnance, and support to persons with disabilities. The dialogue we are hosting today and tomorrow is one of the pillars of this initiative. For more than 40 years, the U.S. and Vietnam have worked together on reconciliation. This extraordinary effort, which has evolved from accounting for missing U.S. personnel to the U.S. now assisting the government of Vietnam in its efforts to recover and identify its own war dead, represents one of the longest and most successful reconciliation processes in recent history. This work is supported by the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, veterans organizations, and countless institutions across the United States. We would like to take this moment to single out, of the many people who have been part of this reconciliation, the leadership of Senator Patrick Leahy, who is one of the longest-serving senators in America's history, and who, before retiring this January, will be leading a congressional delegation to the region to reaffirm Congress's commitment to war legacy cooperation. To start today's event, USIP is honored to host Mr. Michael Schiefer, the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Asia in the United States Agency for International Development. Mr. Schiefer assumed this important role after spending a decade as a senior advisor and counselor on the professional staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Schiefer has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, worked for the Stanley Foundation, received a Council on Foreign Relations Hitachi International Affairs Fellowship in Japan, and was the Senior National Security Advisor and Legislative Director for Senator Dianne Feinstein. I hope everyone joins me in welcoming Assistant Administrator Schiefer and the Institute's Director for Southeast Asia, Brian Harding, for our opening conversation. Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Lise, for the introduction and also your support to the Vietnam War Legacies and Reconciliation Initiative here at USIP. You've already introduced Michael. I think if you've paid any attention to the program, you'll see that we have an incredible lineup. We're going to be doing this in two parts. First, some distinguished current and former officials, and then we're going to hear from two truly extraordinary private citizens who have really devoted their lives to these issues as well. So, being that Michael has been introduced, and I think I'm the one that people are least interested in hearing from, I'll just turn straight to Michael, and I'll introduce our other speakers after Michael finishes his initial remarks.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Lise, and thank you to USIP for organizing this important conversation. I will add that the one piece that you forgot in the introduction was that in addition to all the other things I've done professionally, every now and then I have managed to help or at least not get in the way of Tim Reeser and Senator Leahy. So that may be my biggest accomplishment in all my years in the Senate. The title of today's plenary, as you know, is Healing from the Wounds of War. Healing from anything, especially war, is a journey. The consequences of war don't disappear when the war is over. Wounds heal, but the process can be painful, and the trauma can be carried down for generations. Legacies of war affect our bodies, our memories, our friendships, our politics, even our very soil. They shape our present and our future. America and Vietnam, once enemies, now friends, know and understand this very well. As I was reflecting on the discussion today, I thought of my own journey and how fitting it is that my first public event, this is my debut as assistant administrator, my first public event in my new job is on Vietnam. As a child, I played Vietnam War in the sandbox at my school. And I remember one summer when my favorite swimming teacher at the Keybridge Marriott right across the river here just disappeared. And my parents had to explain to me that he went to Vietnam, and he never came back. Later, growing up in New York, I remember how delighted my parents were when they, that's reassuring. I remember how delighted my parents were when they got to be friends with diplomats from Vietnam's mission to the United Nations. This was in the days before normalization, who lived just the floor below us in our apartment complex. And then some years later, after my father died, I went to Vietnam with my backpack for a month. And over some delicious, and it really was delicious, shakalavong in Hanoi, I finally, for the first time, broke down in tears. And it was on a bench overlooking Han Kiem Lake that I did my mourning for my father and started that healing journey for myself. Since then, I've been able to travel to Vietnam in my work for the Senate. I've been able to travel there accompanying a Secretary of Defense, something that would have been unheard of at one point in our relationship. I've been able to help Tim every now and then. And soon I hope to be able to travel to Vietnam on behalf of USAID. So Vietnam and our relationship and our journey together has been part of my consciousness since I've been conscious. And I've been fortunate to travel along and through our different paths and our partnership and our healing for my entire personal and professional life. There are others, however, for whom the healing is more challenging. I'd like to share with you this morning the story of Tien Nan, who lives with his family in Hue Province and is growing up with developmental disabilities. His parents, Nguyen and Phuong, have concerns early on. He would get easily frustrated and throw tantrums. He couldn't tell them what he needed. Tien wasn't like other children. His parents knew they needed support. But in Vietnam, families like Tien's don't have easy access to health specialists. Families like Tien's, however, need special care. Their children deserve it in order to thrive. And as our two nations continue our journey to healing, we have an obligation to seek to provide it. Across Vietnam, USAID and our partners support children with disabilities and help parents improve their ability to care for their children. We help clinics and hospitals. We help them screen for disabilities as part of routine health checks. We train rehabilitation professionals to get help to the people they need. And we helped Vietnam institute its first ever occupational and speech and language therapy courses in its universities. And with our Vietnamese partners, we're seeing results. In the last 5 years, Vietnam's workforce of skilled rehabilitation practitioners has expanded, making these services available in some districts for the first time, including in Thanh Ninh and Binh Phuc, which now have rehabilitation units staffed with trained and licensed practitioners in each and every one of their districts. And Tien's life is improving as well. His father is able to apply the training he received from USAID, and our partners and both parents are more confident raising their son. Tien is able to help with chores at home and go to school. That is what healing looks like for children, for families, and for countries. Over the 27 years since normalization, our two countries have traveled on an incredible journey together, particularly the past decade in our comprehensive partnership, and as we seek to build a strategic partnership based on our genuine friendship. USAID's current efforts in Vietnam focus on 3 areas in particular: disabilities assistance, dioxin remediation, and identification of the deceased. Let me talk a little bit about each of these areas. Thanks to the historic legislation spearheaded by Senator Leahy, in 1991, USAID began a program designed to address one of the government of Vietnam's expressed priorities on the path towards normalizing relations. This was the needs of Vietnam's war wounded, primarily the 250,000 amputees who had minimal, if any, access to appropriate prosthetic or rehabilitation services. USAID supported the local production and fitting of prosthetic limbs and wheelchairs in partnership with the Vietnamese government and American NGOs. We provided high-quality prosthetic and rehabilitation training for local staff, procured the materials and equipment, and helped construct needed facilities. Since then, our disability programming in Vietnam has grown significantly. We have contributed approximately $140 million in assistance to persons with disabilities over the past 30 years. And as we know, the history of war also remains in Vietnam's soil. In close partnership with the government of Vietnam, USAID is working to remediate 2 of Vietnam's 3 identified hotspots of remaining Agent Orange contamination. We know that together we can be successful in these efforts. Across 6 years, we collaborated with a U.S. small business and a global leader in thermal soil treatment to make Da Nang a cleaner and safer city, with the airport now expanding to utilize 75 acres of clean land. We cleaned up the airport by processing, meaning cooking in batches over 600 degrees, enough dirt to fill 56 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Today, we are working closely with Vietnam to replicate this success at Bien Hoa Air Base, the largest remaining hotspot of dioxin contamination, and an enormous challenge that will involve 4 times the volume of soil that was handled at Da Nang. The United States has so far invested over $160 million towards dioxin remediation at Bien Hoa. Even as we address the legacies of war for today and for the future, we must be mindful that healing also requires our continued attention to address wounds that remain open from the past. With the Department of Defense, we are moving forward with new technology to work with the government of Vietnam to improve its means of identifying missing Vietnamese from the war. We are honored to contribute to this absolutely crucial effort. Families deserve the closure of seeing their loved ones at rest. We cannot forget, ignore, or deny the legacies of the past. We will continue to do our part to address and resolve them, and in so doing, open up the possibilities for the future. Right now, in addition to the areas I discussed, the U.S. and Vietnam partner across a wide array of shared priorities, including improving governance and transparency while strengthening inclusive economic growth, addressing complex environmental challenges such as ocean plastics and the future of the Mekong Delta, and assisting Vietnam in its energy transition to meet its ambitious COP26 goals, increasing student exchanges and higher education cooperation to create a 21st century workforce, global health security cooperation to detect and monitor emerging pandemic threats, and to strengthen health systems resilience in the face of future crisis. Together, these cooperative efforts have helped both our nations heal from the past and to open the door to expanding and deepening the partnership we enjoy today. They promote a more open, secure, and prosperous Vietnam and a more open, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. I look forward to continuing this important work with you and to realize this future for Vietnam and its people. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for taking the time. As Lise mentioned earlier, I think Michael's in his 2nd week on the job, but for a lot of reasons, doesn't need a lot of briefing or getting up to speed because of the role he played in the Congress. And I think, as we've already alluded to with Senator Leahy's role and others, the role of the Congress in this conversation in U.S.-Vietnam relations is fundamental. And so I think anybody who's in this room is thrilled to see you in this job. Time is of the essence, and hopefully with a man who knows the Congress so well, we can seize this moment here in this important time. I'm going to introduce our 2nd speaker in a moment, but I'll just first say to those who are in the room here, there will be time for question and answer. If you can write your questions down on paper that I understand has been provided. Andrew Wells-Dong, who's really running the show here from the front row as our director of our War Legacies and Reconciliation Project, will read those questions after we get through our initial remarks. But our next speaker will be Ambassador Ton Nhu Thi Ninh, who has been a university lecturer, a career diplomat, and an elected official in Vietnam. Among her many important roles, she was Vietnam's ambassador to the European Union in Belgium. She was vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the National Assembly. Today, she is the president of the Ho Chi Minh City Peace and Development Foundation. And as I understand it, if you watch Vietnamese media, you know Ambassador Nguyen. So over to you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, you might wonder why I was invited by Andrew Wells Dang to participate in this dialogue, in this conference. As a multilateralist diplomat, I remember going to New York every year for about 10 years. And I was therefore in contact with a lot of American officials and American friends, as well as members of the Vietnamese American community. And in my capacity as vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Assembly, I was in charge of relations with Europe and America. So, and with that, I was happy to be the co-chair of the first ever US-Vietnam dialogue group on Agent Orange dioxin that the then president of Ford Foundation, Susan Beresford, spearheaded. So in other words, I personally have been involved with matters US-Vietnam. So today, I will take an approach of a reflective approach. This is an opportunity for us, for me anyway, to take stock of what we have achieved together in terms of post-war, post-conflict peace building, which is a complex, difficult process, not easy at all. Within the 10 minutes allotted to each of us on this dense and complex topic of healing the wounds of war, I've chosen to focus on 4 points, to reflect on these angles and layers in order to open perspectives for more in-depth, specific discussion within panel 1B. Since the end of the war, which was in all respects an existentially defining traumatic experience for those involved and concerned, as we just heard, Vietnam and the US, Vietnamese and American people have been engaged on a singular joint journey of post-war peace building through painstaking normalization towards today's broad, multifaceted, and deepening bilateral ties. This has been a challenging, complex, but rewarding process because it did not only emanate from and involve the two governments and officials on both sides, but was also importantly embraced and actively pursued by civil society entities, as well as men and women of goodwill in Vietnam and the US. I would be remiss not to pay homage here to Senator Patrick Leahy and Tim Reeser, who is among us. And we know the sad news that Senator Leahy will retire very soon, but before he retires, we will welcome him with open arms in Vietnam for his, I think, last official, I'm sure not his last, but his last official visit to Vietnam. He has been on the officials' side, perhaps the most steadfast and effective contributor to post-war peace building and remediation. But I wish to mention citizens, men and women of goodwill and civil society entities. For example, on the US side, Geraldine Brousseau and her peace trees. You see, Geraldine Brousseau lost her brother, who was a pilot, and his plane was down in the northern part of Vietnam. Now, she not only managed to overcome, but she started this project in Quảng Ngãi province. She brought the fiancé of her late brother, and many years later, she even brought her mother. It was not easy to do, but you know, she herself, with her Peace Trees project, you know, over the years, and with her family members, she has been a symbol of the kind of overcoming and healing the wounds of war, of one's own will, courage, and determination. I'd like to also mention Chuck Searcy, a Vietnam veteran, and Renew, along with Veterans for Peace. Just these two sort of civil society examples on the US side. On the Vietnamese side, of course, I could mention the Vietnam USA Society, or the throngs of visitors, including American, who visit the War Legacies Museum in Vietnam. And if you haven't been there on one of your visits to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, go there. Don't worry that it's going to be, you know, sort of heavy and this. I mean, it's there to not to forget, but also to move forward. And so I encourage you to go there. Now, normalization of Vietnam-US relations has benefited early on from quasi-unanimous support from the government and the people in Vietnam. The process in the US has been more gradual, and in particular, unfortunately, has faced some vocal resistance from some inflexible members of the Vietnamese American community. But should we not strive to make that joint journey move towards some extent and form of reconciliation, which clearly is a bolder qualitative next step for the whole actors on both sides? Normalization is the first step. Reconciliation is the next qualitative step. Now, because the notion of reconciliation is sensitive, especially for some segments of the Vietnamese American community, let me at this point in time stress the following. First, nearly all families in Vietnam, including mine, had members on both sides of the conflict. It is time, 50 years after the end of the war, to make our own peace among Vietnamese, beyond ideology and politics. To make this happen, let us identify common ground, common interests, and promote mutual engagement, exchanges, and cooperation, as is gradually happening on the ground with second and third post-war generation Vietnamese nationals and Vietnamese Americans. David Thai, back in Vietnam from Seattle in 1998, soon after normalization, set up the now ubiquitous Highlands coffee shop chain. But today, young Vietnamese Americans are also settling down in Vietnam, starting businesses such as a gin distillery with flavor ingredients from local ethnic minorities from the north and from the central highlands, or a Gen Z media platform which reaches out to millions. Meanwhile, someone who experienced the hardships and losses of war during her childhood and adolescence in northern Vietnam, has now made a name for herself with the success of her first novel in English, The Mountains Sing, winner of the 2020 Lannan Literary Award Fellowship for contribution to peace and reconciliation. On the Vietnamese side, properly speaking, there may be 4 factors explaining the support for and progress of normalization and reconciliation between the 2 former adversaries. First is, I believe, Vietnam's deep-rooted sense of nationhood, tested through centuries of trials and tribulations, but which, once the country independent, reunified, and at peace, expresses itself in a shared thirst for and powerful drive towards prosperity and development. It was Ho Chi Minh who kept reminding us during the decolonization struggle not to forget the enemy within. That is, illiteracy, ignorance, and poverty. In other words, our people, the Vietnamese people, are fortunate that they are forward-looking and progress-minded. Another dimension may be the Buddhist influence with its culture of forbearance, which shuns extremism and which cultivates accommodation. A third factor, I believe, is Vietnamese society's cohesive tendencies, fostered by a strong sense of belonging. Belonging within the framework of extended family ties, clan community, and native place frameworks. The fourth factor is the pragmatism, the realism of Vietnam and the Vietnamese in dealing with the past and the present, and also with the outside world. From conflict with several major powers, moving to peaceful, mutually beneficial relations with them, based on a realistic appraisal of common ground, shared interests, and respective strengths and weaknesses through history to the present day, Vietnam has indeed honed its skills at living and working with major powers. Let us heal from the past by joining minds and hearts to build the future. You may have noticed I put minds first for a reason. We can discuss that during the panel. Some might opt for hearts first, but from what I said before that, makes sense. Hearts are sometimes blind. Minds are supposed to be sort of shining and bright, so, and have the heart, in the right direction. Now, although there is definitely a singularity to the U.S.-Vietnam post-war peace building, from what was stated earlier, there may be some considerations of possible relevance to other post-conflict situations in the world. I will mention 2. First, importance of respect for cultural identity and community spirit, as well as the importance of sharing a shared sense of nationhood. Second, agree to disagree on certain matters, and that applies to everyone, both Vietnamese and American. But identify common ground and interests and encourage joint projects involving younger generations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nin. That was fantastic, and so many threads to pick up. And just to pick up on the last one, I mean, this is a lot of what we're trying to think about here at USIP. There's so much more work to do in the U.S.-Vietnam story, but where else? What lessons can we draw from this? Our third and final panelist, before we head to a short question and answer period, is Jed Royal, who we just connected, it turns out, for the first time in over 10 years. Jed is also very new to his job. He's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. And as we were saying earlier, it turns out over the last several years, he's just had an incredibly diverse and impressive tour around all sorts of important parts of the Department of Defense. He's a career member of the Senior Executive Service. His most recent position was as Deputy Director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. He also served at the U.S. mission to NATO and a variety of other positions in OSD policy. He was the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. He's also worked at the NSC, and he started his career on Capitol Hill in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff. So if Jed, I'm guessing, is a new face for many people in this room, but you can be assured that he's one of the top career policy officials, and we're absolutely thrilled that he's in this new position. So over to you, Jed.
And thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you, Lise and Brian, and all of your colleagues for the work that you're doing here, for the work of the Commission in bringing light to these issues. It's just extraordinarily important for us to continue to conduct policy and do policy development with an eye of reflection on the past. And I think that the work you're doing here is absolutely crucial for all of the policy development folks in my department and throughout the U.S. government to be mindful of these issues. So thank you very much for your work here. It's an honor for me to speak with all of you today as we continue to build upon 27 years of work toward the mutual goal of addressing war legacies and strengthening trust and cooperation between our two governments. I want to also start by thanking you for the longstanding commitment and efforts to account for missing U.S. service members, which has contributed to strong support for our bilateral partnership. The mission that is being conducted here is important on so many levels, and it's a privilege for me to be able to share with you some of the thoughts on the relationship between this mission, expanding our areas of cooperation, and on some broader security interests in the region. To date, and since the cessation of the conflict, Vietnam has helped identify more than 700 Americans killed in the war and repatriated them to their families for burial with full military honors. The United States' goal is to reciprocate these efforts, and we have taken some important steps to do so. Last year marked one such step when Secretary Austin and Minister Young decided to a new initiative incorporating DoD-funded state-of-the-art research from Harvard University to help Vietnam account for and recover the remains of its fallen service members. And so far, the results have been very promising. We are particularly sensitive to the fact that we must act quickly as the availability of witnesses diminishes and Vietnam's landscape and terrain changes. And so to that end, just last month during the U.S.-Vietnam Defense Policy Dialogue in Hanoi, Assistant Secretary of Defense Eli Ratner provided Vietnam's leadership with a third tranche of updated archival information to support Vietnamese recovery efforts. He also pledged to help Vietnam explore new, smarter technologies to accelerate and streamline search and recovery operations. Likewise, we know that the U.S. government's efforts to clean up dioxin, support people with disabilities, and remove unexploded ordnance are necessary and important parts of the war legacy mission. Much of the work to address these specific issues is led by the United States Agency for International Development. It's great to be reconnected with Michael Schiffer here after years apart, and to hear his personal experience with all of this, which I have to say is quite touching. Thank you, Michael, for that. So often the work that USAI doing is with funds from the Department of Defense, and we're very proud of the partnership that we have with USAID. DoD is working closely through this partnership to support the dioxin remediation. Cleanup efforts included at Da Nang Airport in 2018, and we recently embarked on an important 10-year project to restore Bien Hoa Air Base and its surrounding areas. I'm also proud to note that since 1989, DoD and USAID donated over $100 million to improve the quality of life of more than 1 million Vietnamese people with disabilities. Moreover, to date, we have helped remove more than 700,000 pieces of unexploded ordnance, while educating hundreds of thousands of Vietnam citizens on risks associated with undetonated mines. During Secretary Austin's visit to Hanoi last year, he avowed that the long process to heal the wounds of war is essential to expanding our cooperation and building our partnership. Our cooperation to address war legacies has built a strong foundation for cooperation in many other areas, including peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, maritime security, and military medicine. We are looking at opportunities to expand cooperation even further into the areas of cybersecurity, defense trade and technology, and aviation. Frankly, there is no limit to the opportunities that we have together. We've also worked seamlessly together in the fight against COVID-19. To date, the United States has transferred more than 40 million vaccines and critical medical equipment to Vietnam, whose approach and overall response to the pandemic has been nothing short of exemplary and a model for other countries to follow in the region. Our collective work responding to the COVID-19 pandemic has also paved the way to prevent and control the spread of other infectious diseases and develop sound frameworks for responses to future pandemics and epidemics. Another highlight of our growing relationship is the development of flood-resilient infrastructure throughout Vietnam. Together, we have built more than 100 flood-resilient schools, clinics, and bridges, and 14 disaster management coordination centers across the country. We are also collaborating extensively to enhance Vietnam's maritime domain awareness and help it protect its sovereign rights through its exclusive economic zone. Notably, these areas of expanded cooperation are vitally important for economic development, peace, and global security. And they reaffirm our commitment to a strong, prosperous, and independent Vietnam. In the spirit of our growing partnership, however, we need to ensure we are being transparent on issues that can create challenges for expanded cooperation, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region. In particular, the United States is sensitive to Vietnam's position in the region and its need to maintain non-escalatory and balanced foreign relations. The United States' approach to the Indo-Pacific region is simple. We believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific rooted in international rules and norms. And further, we believe that each country within that region should be independent and free to determine its own course and to promote a system of values that ensures opportunity for even the smallest of countries to thrive, free from coercion. The U.S.-Vietnam Comprehensive Partnership has played a key role in advancing these shared strategic goals for the region, and that burgeoning relationship was made possible through our foundational work in the war legacy arena. The United States and Vietnam have made extraordinary progress over the last several decades in overcoming past animosities and building a positive partnership that not only benefits our peoples, but the broader Indo-Pacific region and the world in general. While much work remains, dedicated people have worked hard to resolve these issues in a way that address the humanitarian concerns while contributing to the pillar of stability and prosperity in the region and setting a positive example for the rest of the world to follow. If there is one message that I would want to leave you with today, it is that the United States is engaged and ready to cooperate with you deeper and more meaningful ways to enhance our bilateral relationship and global security. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thanks, Jed. We have about 10 more minutes for this part of the panel before we remove a chair and change chairs. So I'm going to go directly to Andrew Wells-Dung, who has been curating questions in the first row. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. So an opening question for Ambassador Ning and perhaps also for other speakers. Do you think there's an endpoint to the healing from war? How would we know when we've gotten there? Or are we already there? If not yet, what needs to happen now almost 50 years after the end of the war to get to that point? Thanks.
I've been wont to say that the paradox, the irony is that normalization and healing and reconciliation between the Vietnamese inside the country with non-Vietnamese Americans has been moving faster and more smoothly than with the Vietnamese American community. And this is a paradox, because you would think, you know, with everything I said about culture, identity, you know, family, native place, and that sort of thing, it would help the rapprochement. But as I said, you know, because a few members of the community here are being obsessed by the past, they cannot overcome. I will use the word overcome. If we inside the country, we can overcome, then we hope that within the community here, they will also overcome and look forward. Anyway, I mentioned it. The younger ones, they are voting with their feet. They are finding opportunities back in Vietnam. And vice versa, young Vietnamese educated in the US sometimes find better opportunities here. These are facts of life. So what I'm saying is, it's still a process. It's gone forward a bit faster in the past decade or so. But I think we need to be proactively engaged to push it forward more effectively. And for that, I think, as I said, you know, in a bit abstract way, let's find common grounds. There are common grounds. But for that, you need practical initiatives. Yesterday, I was having lunch with Erin Steinhauser, the wife of the relatively well-known photographer who's done wonderful, beautiful photographs of Vietnam. And she said that she has started a society to do precisely that. I have spoke online via Zoom with Kenneth Nguyen in California, who was born obviously in California, but who has interviewed more than 100 overseas Vietnamese, and mostly Vietnamese American, and is very curious and supportive of doing things together among Vietnamese, regardless of where you were born or where you live. So I would say that the process needs to continue to be carried forward. But I think it's encouraging, but it means we need to work at it. It won't happen of itself and by itself. And so we hope that our American friends, non-Vietnamese American friends, will also help. Those that travel regularly to Vietnam, perhaps you could take a few still reticent Vietnamese American along with you. Why not?
Well, I'll just take the opportunity to put in one plug for the work we're trying to do here at USIP. We did a series of online dialogues on different war legacies topics over the last year, 5 of them in total. Just speak for myself, perhaps the most interesting one was a youth dialogue. And there was a heavy emphasis on Vietnamese American inclusion. And so people who didn't experience the war, Americans, Vietnamese American, non-Vietnamese Americans, Vietnamese, how do they think about the war? And this is a line of work that we hope to continue and build on with partners in Vietnam. Andrew?
Yeah, second question for Jed Royal, and again, others who would like to comment. There are both military and civilian authorities involved in healing the wounds of war and war legacies. How do you see the relationship between those, and how can they work better together, both in the U.S. and in Vietnam and other countries?
Thanks for that question. I think the answer is we have to work symbiotically with each other. There are going to be touch points, some of the tactile elements of this that government is simply just not well positioned to feel and to understand. Those who are deeply committed to this mission need to be we in government need to be making sure that we're soliciting that information from them, building that into the way that we think about our management of resources, about the way that we manage our time, and overall the rhetorical approach that we're taking on the state of bilateral relations and multilateral relations. Just to reflect on the previous question for a moment as well, I do very much hope for healing in this relationship, and that we do find an end point, because we all want to be whole. But I certainly hope that we don't forget, and healing should never come at the expense of forgetting, and we need to make sure that we are building in that memory into the way that we think about our role and responsibilities today as government officials, and we rely deeply on the civil society to help us understand that and appreciate that as we go through the process. So you can be assured that the Department of Defense is very open to those conversations, very interested in those conversations consistently. Thank you.
Andrew? Michael, unless you want to jump.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just to build off of Jed's last point about the importance of civil society. I guess I'll just offer on the civil-military cooperation question when it comes to addressing some of the war legacies, that there is another piece of this puzzle, which is civil society actors, NGOs, and local communities. And it's often the civil society actors who are most in touch with the people in the local communities and have the best sense of what their needs are. And so in addition to making sure that our two military and civilian development establishments are working together, both our interagency here in Washington and its equivalent in Hanoi, we also need to be working effectively with the NGOs and the civil society actors in local communities to make sure that we actually understand and are responsive to their needs when it comes to war legacies and this process for healing.
I add one word, very, very brief, about military to military. I think it is helpful to the Vietnamese military to be in contact and exchanges and training with counterparts from the US or from Australia and so on and so forth. I have in mind the rather tight, close cooperation between our military, the peacekeeping operation unit within the Ministry of Defense, very close cooperation with their Australian counterpart, and it has helped us deploy very successfully 2 or 3 field hospitals in South Sudan. And to me, in a sense, this is the kind of cooperation that fosters person to person, less formal, or, as I understand, military discipline and rigor, perhaps lends itself less to these kinds of contact than training for, say, peacekeeping operations, which I'm really happy that Vietnam has started moving into, first with field hospitals, and I now see even also with engineering. And so I don't know whether the US is cooperating on that at all. I know that the Australians are, and I believe that there is a sort of kind of psychologically speaking, it helps our own military enter into less formal or rigid contacts with their international counterpart. Just a thought, yeah.
We have time for one more.
So we have several questions from Vietnamese American participants in person and online, saying they're grateful for U.S.-Vietnamese cooperation on finding remains and on war legacy issues. So maybe I'll ask Michael Schiffer, how can Vietnamese Americans be more involved in the humanitarian assistance and cooperation that USAID is doing, and also other agencies?
Well, I mean, to pick up on my previous comments, I think they can, the Vietnamese American communities here, whether it's reaching out through their members of Congress or engaging with USAID, with the Department of Defense, the Department of State, can certainly help us in our thinking about where we need to be focused, where the real problems are, and what the issues are that need to be addressed. And that, includes both the sort of immediate health or environmental or other needs of people in Vietnam. It also includes, how we go about continuing to be mindful and aware of the tender spot that that still exists and will always exist in this relationship, so that we can continue to understand each other better, to draw closer, and to find for forgiveness and closure for a tragic period in both of our histories.
Well, thank you very much. That we could keep on going clearly, but we've promised that you'll get back to your offices, and also we have an incredible agenda for the next 2 days. So we're going to soon transition to the second part of our plenary here without a break. But first, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel. Thank you so much for taking the time. Good to see you. Again in 24 hours, tomorrow from 9 to 10:30 online with another incredible panel of non-government and government experts. But I'm thrilled that we could have the second part, and we thought it was about to get a little too crowded on the stage here with 5, it turned out, so we decided to put it into two parts. But I think one thing, if you even just read the title of the day's event, and that is Dialogue on War Legacies and Peace in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We were very intentional here in thinking about what we wanted to do over the course of these 2 days, whether this was all going to be about U.S.-Vietnam relations, U.S.-Vietnam cooperation, but we very quickly, with thinking about this, recognized, of course, that this was a regional war that touched many people, those who live outside of Vietnam during the war, and the diaspora today. And so wanted to include a conversation about Laos and Cambodia. And we're absolutely thrilled to have 2 just incredible people to join our panel to get us kicked off. We're going to start on the far side with Loan Ung, who we're absolutely thrilled to have here at USIP today, I think for the first time. She is a best-selling author, public speaker, activist, and co-screenplay writer of First They Killed My Father, a critically acclaimed 2017 movie directed with Angelina Jolie, based on her memoir that is streaming on Netflix. Loan started her activism work in 1993 as the community educator for a domestic shelter in the state of Maine. And since then, she's worked on various campaigns to end violence against women and the use of child soldiers, eradicate landmines globally. In 1995, Luong made our first trip back to Cambodia, and she's returned over 40 times since, really devoting herself to helping her native land heal from the traumas of war. In addition to her best-selling book, First They Killed My Father, Luong is also the author of Lucky Child and Lulu in the Sky, and a contributor writer on the film Girl Rising, directed by the award-winning director Richard Robbins. I'd just say on a personal note, I would never forget, and I think anybody who's ever read her book would never forget reading her book. And for me, it was, as a recent college graduate, traipsing around Southeast Asia, reading everything I could about the region, and her book was one that I can never forget. I'm afraid, though, I probably read a copy that did not get a royalty back to you, as is the case for many. But Luong, let's start with you and with some initial thoughts, and then I'll introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's very wonderful to be here with you all. And Tim, I see you. For many of us, all roads in this room and outside out there, all roads lead to Tim Reeser and Patrick Leahy. And that was mine as well. So Tim, thank you so much for encouraging me to write my book many, many years ago. And Senator Patrick Leahy, my personal hero. And so it's wonderful to be here. When I was asked, or Andrew wrote me and said, you've got 10 minutes to share your thoughts about healing from the wounds of war. That's like asking somebody to look in the sky and say, you've got 10 minutes to tell me how many stars there are in the sky. Both are impossible to pinpoint. However, I do think there are some components that are perhaps universal in the issue of healings from the wounds of war. As a Buddhist, we believe that healing really entails doing the work for body, mind, and spirit. As a writer, I also think that there are components to healings that we should all address, especially when we're talking about healings from the wounds of war. And these are multi-pronged, multi-layers, levels or components of healings that we must serve as a constellation of guiding lights toward the path. And in order to even think about healing, we have to address first the personal, individual healing, as well as the national level of healing, and also our global responsibility and our global work that we all need to do to address the long tails of war. And so the national healing for me, and of course in 10 minutes, I will just briefly give my thoughts on some of what I think we need to look at. On the national level, from 1975 to 1979, Cambodia as a country suffered a collective trauma. Trauma that did not happen to 1 or 3 or 4 of us, but trauma that happened to all 7 million of us in a country the size of the state of Oklahoma. Trauma that happened when the Khmer Rouge came into our country on April 17, 1975, and in the span of 3 years, 8 months, and 21 days, went on and enacted the Marxist-Leninist policy to create a new utopian agrarian society in which money and wealth were abolished, power was taken from the poor and the workers of the country and given to the elites and the true revolutionaries. I'm assuming all of us here know a little bit of Cambodia, so I won't go into that politics. But as a survivor, it was trauma that forced us to live in fear for the next 4 years of our lives, in which our rights, one by one, were taken from us. First, the soldiers came into my country, and then they pulled out their bullhorns and they started screaming to all of us in the city to leave our homes. And if we did not leave, the Americans and their B-52 metal killing birds would come into the nation, bomb our skies and our land, and we would all be killed. And then we were forced to live in villages for the next 4 years that were more akin to labor camps, and in which every day was a Monday, and every Monday a work day. And it didn't matter if you were 6 or 60. You dug trenches, you built dams, you grew food, that then the trucks came in and took the food away, came back with guns and arms to support a war you didn't vote for, you didn't want, you didn't understand, but you had no voice. That was the trauma. You could not speak up. Anybody and everybody who refused and disagreed with the Khmer's communist policies were viewed as enemies of the state. And the solution for these enemies of the state was to purge or crush them. So while we lived in fear and starved one by one, the soldiers came and collected the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the dancers, and had them executed en masse. And still, in a place like that, everywhere they looked, they saw more enemies, more traitors. So they sent out more soldiers. And this time they collected the daughters and the sons and the fathers and the mothers of the people they killed, and they had them executed. That was my trauma. Cambodia as a country went through this collective trauma together. By the end of the Khmer's regime on January 7th, 1979, when I was 9 years old, an estimated of 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians would perish from starvation, disease, hard labor, execution, out of a population of 7 million people. Over a quarter of the people of the country's population. Among the victims were both my parents, 2 sisters, and 20 other relatives. And so I'm very passionate and have been following the tribunal that had been established and long history and complicated history that started in 1997 when the 2 prime ministers went and asked the UN to help create a hybrid tribunal, or a tribunal that eventually, after 10 years of negotiation, became a hybrid Cambodian UN tribunal to put on trials key leaders of the Khmer's for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This past September 22nd, the tribunal officially closed after it's officially closed, which after having spent 16 years and $337 million to convict all of 3 old men. There were observers who were critical of the tribunal itself. Completely, yes, a very flawed system. $370 million to convict 3 old men. I might have agreed with that had I not been a survivor. I might have believed that that was money not well spent had I not been a survivor. As a survivor, the numbers that matter more to me are 2 million of 7 million people, 2 parents, 2 sisters, 20 relatives, and the 5 million survivors who know very little of what happened to their family members. As a survivor, what the tribunal did was to push to gather information that we did not know exist, that we did not know where to find. And it was the funding and the push to start, and led by DC CAM, the Cambodian Documentation Center, and their team of researchers that went out to the 35 provinces in Cambodia to gather multiple millions of documents that are now gathered in a centralized location. So that we now, if we need to know, when we're ready to know, can find this information. And also the push of work to map out 20,000 mass graves in a country the size of the state of Oklahoma. Mass graves that once Cambodian kids thought were merely perhaps bomb shelters or craters or ponds that turn out to house and turn out to be the graves of over 1 million skulls of somebody's loved ones. Majority of them were not killed with bullets, but blunt instruments to the back of their heads. So as a country, Cambodia needed this tribunal for more than anything, I think, for the residual, for the information gather, and for the education for the descendants of all the people killed and for the people who survived. So that for me is briefly the national level. The individual level, this is something I know well through my writing and through my work, and it's why I went to Cambodia for that first time in 1995, and why I've been back to Cambodia on over 40 trips, and why I keep going and keep telling the story of Cambodia. Healing from the wounds of war requires that we also heal ourselves, because are we not part of this world? Are we not, all 8 billion of us, part of this world? And we are to heal on this greater issue. We also have to look at our own individual personal story. For Americans and for my friends, my story is very unimaginable. For the Cambodians I know, my story is not unique. For the 100, 120, or 160 million people in our world who have gone through wars, my story is not unique. I have friends who were once one of 8 and are now the only survivor. I have friends who are like me when they go back to Cambodia and they look at that sunset. It is not beauty they see, but horrors and hell. I have haunted nightmares in Cambodia that have taken me many years to create new memories to overshadow or at least fade the memories of the war. Of the last sunset I remember being aware of in Cambodia when the soldiers came for my father. And as they walked my father off with guns on their back into the sunset, and I looked at that sky, and the gods that night had painted this palette of gold, magenta, red, and pink, shimmering in its multiple divine colors. All I felt was hate in my heart. And all I asked was, why did the world not see this? How was it possible that people in other parts of the world were seeing this beautiful sunset when I only saw hell? How was it possible, but when I looked at that sun, I wished for it to be a weapon that would explode and take me out and take all of us out? There was rage, there was hurt, and that was kind of memories that would take me many decades to build upon. For the truth is too hard to bear. That in a country the size of the state of Oklahoma, we have over 20,000 mass graves. Majority of them were killed with blunt instruments to the back of their heads, smashed to the back of their heads. For my friends and I, who are Cambodians, our wish today and our wish then when I was 9 years old continue to be that I hope and pray the soldiers use one of their bullets to end my father's life, to make his death quick and painless. What do other children of the world prayed for when they were 7? What do they wish for their children? I am heartened and happy to say that in 1975, Cambodia had all of 2 psychiatrists. In a country that was Buddhist in nature, we believe in astrology and animism and luck, that we now have 60 psychiatrists, and that the destigmatization of mental issues and mental illness is now much more accepted. 60 psychiatrists for 16 million people. Imagine that. I am heartened that still it is shifting and it is changing, because when you listen to Cambodia, we don't talk about the wars, we don't talk about the horrors, but we will tell you ghost stories and being possessed and a monster coming in. But if you listen closely, you hear residual talks of what these possessions, what they look like, what they did. And lastly, very briefly, our global healing, what we need to do and what we need to admit to ourselves and each other. When I came to America and I went to school and I studied Russian history, American history, Vietnamese history even, there was perhaps one whole sentence on Cambodia. And it enraged me and it confused me. For how is it possible that we don't talk about Cambodia, that we don't know Cambodia, when in fact, Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge might have not happened had the US war not moved over to Cambodia. And the bombings bombed Cambodia and dropped 500,000 tons of bombs onto a neutral country at that time. And it succeeded in killing anywhere between 150 to 200,000 Cambodians and destabilized the land, pushing the farmers off, moving them into the city where there was no food, no shelters, no safety. And then opening up the borders, it's lots of discussions on how Sihanouk, the ruling of the time, was ousted from power. But we do know Lon Nol, his replacement, opened the war, brought in the US, and then the war full-fledged came into Cambodia. And when the US left Vietnam and left Cambodia, the Khmers went from a couple of thousand ragtag guerrilla troops in the jungle to many thousands taking over the country. How is it that in my class I never heard of Cambodia? And in college, I had to go and buy my own books about Cambodia. And that Cambodia somehow is never a part of Vietnam legacy. That should not be. We in this global world, to talk about global healing, has to address the long tails of war, and that wars do not stay within borders, especially when the borders was broken open when wars went into our country. But wars ricochet in its tails, does not end when guns fall silent, and does not stay when we are so intertwined and move about. I know I'm coming upon my time. What gives me hope is that we are telling our own stories. That our Cambodians are telling it as dancers, as musicians, as writers, as activists, as policymakers. What gives me hope on the talk Healings from the Wound of Wars is that the heart, our human heart, is the most vital organ in the human body. And for as many times as it breaks, with assistance, with education, with awareness, it has the ability and capability to heal.
Thank you, Long. Powerful and inspiring. But time is short, so we will move on to our next speaker to make sure we have a little bit of time. Once again, Andrew Wells-Dong will be collecting questions online and in person. So if you have one in person, please note it down on a piece of paper. Our last speaker is going to be Sarah Gulabdura, who serves as Executive Director of Legacies of War. It's the only international US-based advocacy and educational organization working to address the impacts of the American secret war in Laos and conflict in neighboring countries of Cambodia and Vietnam during the Vietnam War era, including the removal of unexploded ordnance and victor and survival assistance. Before taking on this new role, Sarah was a longtime volunteer and served on Legacies board for 5 years, so she was the perfect person to take over. And under her leadership, US funding for UXO clearance in Laos has reached $45 million, the largest level in history. And I'll also say that if anybody has run into Sarah, you'll know that she's been working with some key members of Congress to really scale this assistance in by considerable orders of magnitude. So over to you, Sarah. We'd love to hear about your work and how we should think about Laos in this story.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and thank you so much to USIP for inviting me to be a part of today's very, very important discussion. Thanks especially to my friend Andrew for the invitation and Ginny for all her coordination. I don't know where she is. But it's such an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you here today. I see so many friends in the audience, and I know many tuning in online. So I was actually born and raised in Laos up to the age of 6 years old. Most of my memories, childhood memories, are very, very fun and beautiful ones. One in particular, I remember running in the grounds of the ancient Wat Pu in the southern part. It was my favorite thing to chase the cats, goats, and the notorious monkeys. Every time I think about these wonderful childhood memories of growing up, in Laos, darker memories would creep in, to my thoughts. You see, my father was a surgeon, and he worked on countless victims of UXO accidents or unexploded ordnance. And many of these victims that he worked in numerous villages were around the same age as my siblings and I. And I would never forget the blood and their cries when my father had to do emergency surgery on them. During that time, 1990, when I was 6 years old, there was no professional demining organization working in Laos. And my parents just saw a very, very bleak and just dangerous future for their children. So we ended up fleeing to the United States. And we landed right here in our nation's capital. I remember it being a cold day. And for the first time in my life, I was riding in a fast-moving car, huge highway, passing countless majestic monuments, the White House, the Pentagon. As a child, I was in awe, and I was wonderstruck by all of these images. I still am today. But back then, as a 6-year-old, I had no idea the connection and the deep history between the United States, my new home, and my birthplace of Laos. I had no idea that from 1964 to 1973, the US dropped over 2.5 million tons of ordnance during 580,000 bombing mission over Laos. That's equivalent to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 straight years, earning Laos the unwanted title of being the most bombed country per capita in history. Over 700,000 people were killed, maimed, or became refugees, like my own family, who had to flee. If that wasn't enough suffering, 30% of these bombs fell to detonate on impact, leaving millions of cluster bombs the size of a tennis ball scattered all throughout every 18 provinces in Laos. And of these 18 provinces, 50% are considered severely contaminated, meaning farmers can't till their land. This hinders progress. This hinders a child from walking to school in safety, roads building. It hinders literally all aspects of Laos life, in Laos. Since the war has ended, about 25,000 people, at least 25,000 people, are still being injured or killed by these unexploded ordnance. 40% of the victims are children, meaning those under the age of 18. You know, today, as a Lao American, I'm proud to represent Legacies of War as the new director. Because the good news is, you know, there is a solution to this problem. And if we work together, we can rid Laos of these unexploded ordnance. And Legacies exist because this is a contemporary issue, and it's a humanitarian issue, and it deserves our attention, constant attention. While the war has been over for nearly 50 years, people's lives are still impacted today. And Legacies address this problem in 3 different ways. The first is our grassroots advocacy efforts that Brian mentioned. The second is our educational work. The third is building the next pipeline of leaders to carry forth the torch, because I plan to retire one day. So let me talk to you about our advocacy effort. You know, Legacies of War is the leading voice in terms of pushing for increased funding for Laos since our founding in 2004. So back in those days, funding was a little under $3 million to today, $45 million that Brian shared, the highest funding level in history. And funding increases makes a huge impact. In 2004, the number of deaths and injuries was around 300 per year. Fast forward to the past 3 years, under 50. Under 50. That's a huge progress. And there's still more work to be done, which is why we will continue to work with congressional champions like Senator Leahy and Tim Reeser and others to make sure that funding for Laos continue to increase. Second, I also, believe that our country can do a lot more than just funding, because cluster bombs, landmines are indiscriminate weapons. They can't tell the difference between a child or a combatant. So we need to join in with other NATO members and ban these weapons. I hope that in the next 2 years or so, Congress and President Biden will accede to the Mine Ban Treaty as well as the Convention on Cluster Munition, taking a stance that the U.S. is a leader in humanitarian issue, that we will join the 100 other countries that have already acceded to these 2 international treaties. The second piece of our work, I love what you said about not learning, though I don't love that you didn't learn about Cambodian history. But while the American Secret War is a part of American history, it is not taught in American schools. So Legacies of War address this in several different ways. The first one is our podcast, which I hope you all will tune in. The executive producer of this is in this room, Alina Intali. This is very short, 15 to 20 minutes interviews with demining partners like mine advisory groups, as well as survivors, as well as environmental experts, talking about the importance of mine action work in very short, simple to listen to clips. The second is one that I'm particularly very proud of. We call this the Legacies Library. And this is a repository of information all related to the American Secret War in the forms of documentaries, books, articles, and other. And hopefully in the future, when we build greater capacity at Legacies of War, we can also include more on Cambodian history and Vietnam history as well. Our crowning jewel in our Legacies Library, we call them the originals. This is a collection of illustrations and written testimony from survivors and victims of the US bombings themselves. This is the only primary source documentation that exists from survivors from this time period. And we have this housed at Legacies of War. I just want to share briefly one of the images, just because, I think like many of you, I've been following the war in Ukraine. And this one, you know exactly why I chose it. But this is an image of a burning school building with fires all around it. And the caption that's on this particular illustration reads, "The school was hit and burned. There were many people in the school who died. But I didn't know who because I wasn't courageous enough to look. I was afraid that the airplanes would shoot me." That's written by a 16-year-old child watching his school burn. So we preserve these for future generation. And all of the educational content that Legacies of War has is free of charge, because we believe that everyone should know about this history, especially Americans. History, storytelling has a way of healing, has a way of allowing victims and survivors to reclaim that narrative, and it's also a form of justice. The very final piece of our work that I want to highlight is our investment in the next generation of young leaders who want to take mine action, who want to continue to preserve and share this history, who also are doing amazing things interning at Legacies of War. We partner with a variety of different universities all across the United States, one of which my dear friend Paul from the University of Dayton Human Rights Center has an intern with Legacies. And this year, I'm particularly proud that we're able to, the first time in history, bring an intern with us on our annual study trip to Laos this year. This is a huge investment in the next generation so that they see firsthand experience of what it's like for deminers to work in the field, to see programs that assist victims and survivors. So I'm really looking forward to the trip this year. In closing, I just want to say that the legacies of war are immeasurable, and the pain spans generations. And there's many, many forms. And healing is slow, but healing is possible with the right actionable. I'm proud of my country, the United States of America, for being the largest single funder globally in demining efforts. The United States invests about 36% of all funding for demining work globally. In Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, since 1993, we invested $657 million. And I hope that members of Congress and leaders will continue to invest in Southeast Asia and grow this pot of funding so we can find those bombs before a child does. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. You know, it's clear that for on the strategic side of things, Congress definitely is increasingly focused on Southeast Asia, but making sure we have a rich, holistic picture of the situation, our history, what it takes to overcome it. What you're doing is just incredibly important on so many dimensions. Andrew, I know we have time for a couple more questions, and I've seen a lot of cards making their way to you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you both for sharing both personally and nationally and globally about the meaning of healing from war. And this comes, I think, to the heart of USIP's mission as a peace-building organization. USIP works both in countries that are affected by conflict and coming out of conflict, and also in the US on peace education. And we have one question from the audience, that both of you were discussing the lack of coverage of Laos and Cambodia in US schools. What can educators do to make students more aware and to take action about healing from war? Maybe Lo first.
They can teach my book. That would be really helpful. I mean, it's thankfully a lot of them are teaching my books in different university, colleges, and high school. But you know, I do think also that I always say to students, if you have 5 minutes, listen to NPR. You know, listen to actual real news. And then if you have 11 minutes, listen to Morning Edition. But we need to really get our students to pay attention to real news. And you know, my books, or Ishmael Bay, or Big Toronto, Bivang, many where stories are, where stories have real relevance to human life, to human beings, and not just snippets and not just sound bites. And I really do think it is so important that we teach young people just the importance of learning real news, relevant news, truthful news, as opposed to social media news. And because everything starts with an education, and everything starts with knowing what is true and what is false. And so for me, there's just really starts with education.
Yeah, one resource that I would recommend is Legacies Library. It's a free online legasiesofwar.org that teachers, professors can access. But I think the main issue here is that it's systematic, right? Like, this isn't taught. I mean, I went to school here in the US, and we maybe spent a day, if not, if a day and a half on the Vietnam War, and Laos was a footnote if we were lucky. But it's educators not knowing themselves sometimes, right? So we can't blame them. But having broader outreach, organizations doing the work like ourselves, and teachers having that interest to make outreach to find curriculum that we have, free of charge. But I would encourage people to talk to one another about what you learn, or what you know, and encourage people to talk to their members of Congress, and to get this into the school system.
I mean, and certainly the political legacy of the Vietnam War in the United States is very complicated. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and hopefully with some more distance we can teach the war, understand the war in a more sophisticated way. And I think part of doing that is thinking broader and geographically as well. So hopefully there could be opportunities.
Yeah. I'll add one last piece to this, is that the war has impacted many, many different segments of Americans, as well as 1.5 generations like myself. Being able to bravely tell the stories like you, right, from a personal perspective, is powerful, and it also allows people to hear from someone who has that lived experience. But there are many others. I'll just kind of share. One of our amazing board member, Jessica Pierce Rotundi, wrote a book, What We Inherit. And this is about finding the place where her uncle's plane crashed in Laos, right? That is a whole different segment of the American public that has been touched by this secret war. So more people need to write, right?
And I also just think what happened in Cambodia, write, bake, dance, whatever it is that is your expression, just to tell your story. But I also think it's so important for us. One, we need to learn about Cambodia and Laos and its connection to the global world, but also that what happened in Cambodia did not happen in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. What happened in Cambodia did not just happen to Cambodians. The Khmer Rouge killed 1.72 million people. Those were crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. Not only crimes against Cambodians, those were crimes against all 8 billion of us. And therefore we need to know, because this whole history, human history of never again since World War II, never again has become again and again and again in Bosnia and Cambodia and Rwanda. And if we don't learn our whole history, if we don't learn our complete history, we will keep on making and repeating the same darn mistakes. And really, we can do better than that. We are humanities. We are human beings. We have free will. We have potentials. We can send people to, again, now to the moon for however many times. We are it. Until we can leave this and go to Mars and colonize there, this is it. And so we have to learn our global history, because what happens in Cambodia is not that far to what happened here. And really, is it that unimaginable when we read about Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, of young people who strap on weapons? We're seeing it in America. All the violence taking place here. When you were raised in hate, and you are encouraged to live in hate, and you are breed to think hate 24/7 on a daily basis. As a former child soldier, when my parents were killed and the soldier put guns half my body's weight, a third my body's height, and told me to hurt, and told me if I didn't hurt you first, you would hurt me, I have no doubt if the war hadn't ended, I would have been a very efficient soldier. But I am actually an activist for peace, because people stepped out of their ways, lent us a helping hand, and helped me to not only survive the war, but to thrive in peace. And that is our work. To create peace, we have to help people get hate out of them, heal their heart, and thrive in peace. And we can do that. We can do so much. And I absolutely, this is why I'm so optimistic. I know we can do it. We can do it because it happened to me. I was the most hateful little kid you could have met when I was young. And I would have no doubt, small, but I could probably take a lot of people out. At least I believe that. I probably could. But I'm choosing to use my voice differently, because I was taught and shown by Patrick Leahy, by Tim Reeser, by Bobby Mueller, by Andrew, to do things differently, to create peace and not fight war.
long, Sarah. We're honored that you're able to join us. We thank you for taking the time. I think we've had an incredible kickoff to our 2 days here, a diversity of views of which is flashback and topics of which is flashback 45 minutes ago when Michael, Jed, and Ambassador Nin were sitting up here. So please join me in thanking our 2 panelists again. Reminder, we'll be online tomorrow morning as well. So thank you so much.